I've been interested in memory for quite a long time now. Yeah, it all started right here with this book. If you've ever studied a language before, then you know that one of the biggest hurdles is vocabulary.
Can you
just ask me on a date?
You know, starting out, no matter how much I racked my brain, I just couldn't even remember the words I studied from a couple days prior. Of course, I went online and tried to research what is the best way to learn a language. Pretty soon after I got past all that basic SEO stuff, I fell down this insane rabbit hole of intense Japanese learners. These were incredibly dedicated learners, putting in 8 to 12 hours per day on average studying the language. They even developed a technique to essentially never forget any vocabulary word or fact that you come across. The method, it's called I+1. And today, I want to share that with you. So essentially, there's 3 parts to understanding how I+1 works, which is recall, context, and repetition. Let me first explain recall and repetition, starting with how memory works. In the 1800s, German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus wanted to find out when and why we would forget things. So he took a bunch of flashcards, created a bunch of meaningless words, and tried to memorize them. And for the next few weeks and months, he documented when he would forget those things. And when he plotted that on a graph, it was beautiful. There was a clear pattern of how a piece of memory decayed over time. And he called this the forgetting curve. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, so we forget things over time. I already knew that. But what he found out was that if he just spent 1 minute recalling the flashcard right before he was going to forget them, it would strengthen that memory and the rate at which it decayed would slow down. And so he would do this again, again, and again, until he never forgot this word, ever. So essentially, he cracked the code of recall and repetition. You want to actively recall a piece of memory near when you're gonna forget them. And you basically just repeat this until the memory decays so slowly that you never forget it again. And that's pretty much how every piece of information in our brain works. As soon as we learn something new, our brains try to forget it. It might take a day, a week, or a month, but if we just try to recall it near we're gonna forget them, the timer would increase again. Sort of like a payphone where you have to put in coins before the timer runs out. So now the question becomes, how do we know when we're going to forget something? In comes the 21st century. A programmer invents an application called Anki. It's pretty much just a flashcard application, but instead of just saying pass or fail, you grade a card hard, medium, or easy. And based on this, it estimates a forgetting curve for you and only shows you the flashcard when it thinks you're about to forget it, essentially minimizing your review time and maximizing your recall ability. So of course, the first thing is that medical school students found this and exploited the application to cram for exams. And it worked, but only temporarily. They found themselves burnt out from the amount of reviews that they had to do. They still often would not be able to recall the information in a real life setting.
For example, you could do like 1 million flashcards, but then afterwards, if you have a conversation with someone, you may still struggle.
This is Justin Sung, a memory researcher that makes YouTube videos.
And they have like more cards than they even know what to do with. And every time they take a break, they just start the cards from scratch because they never got to finish their deck. And they eventually get to a point where they've got so many things on repeat that they just give up on even doing all of them that's you, and they just sort of start again. It does achieve that like very specific type of retrieval in terms of getting some words into your vocabulary and getting them in enough frequency. But the thing is that it's not necessary to do it in that way.
And the hardcore language learners would use the same application to study vocabulary words. But the only difference is they understood one thing that the medical school students did not, and that was context. You see, just reviewing flashcards only fulfilled 2 out of the 3 components of a long-lasting memory, which is context, recall, and repetition. The missing piece was context, or as the language learners call them, input. The method that I'm describing, I+1, stands for input plus 1 piece of new information. This method came from the linguist Stephen Krashen, who theorized that
to begin my presentation this afternoon by talking about what I think is the most important issue in language education, the most important question, and that is, how do we acquire language? And I'd like to begin this discussion, this presentation, with an outrageous statement. In my opinion, we all acquire language the same way.
Which is through context. So we learn words when we hear a new vocabulary word in a sentence that we fully understood, context. And if you combine context with active recall and repetition, you'll essentially never forget the word again. And my whole point is that we don't just acquire language in that way, we also acquire knowledge in that way too.
The structure and the context and how the information is perceived makes a really big difference to how understandable and how easy it is to actually retain. So a word that comes up in just normal conversation And you looking that up in the context of using that word immediately for the purposes of that conversation allows you to retain that word much better than just purely doing it beforehand.
So if you take existing knowledge plus one piece of new information that you're trying to remember, you're never gonna forget it. But how do you practically use that to learn a new piece of information? Let me explain. So when you learn a new piece of information, your brain tries to form neural connections with other things that it already knows, which was the core of the method, I+1. When this clicked in my head, I realized that I could pretty much apply this to every piece of information that I come across. You see, the only reason we forget things that we read is because there's not enough pieces of context in our brain to internalize it. The more pieces of context that you can tie to a pre-existing memory or knowledge, the stronger that memory is, and the less likely that you'll forget it even for months or years. Instead of just taking notes on the book when you're reading it, think of an example where it applies in your real life and write down that instead. So for example, let's say I wanted to remember the 80-20 principle. Rather than writing down the 80-20 principle asserts that a minority of causes, inputs, or efforts usually lead to a majority of the results, outputs, or rewards. What I'll do is that I'll write in my journal that 80% of the views from my channel basically comes from 20% of the videos. And just reframing the knowledge in that way creates more pieces of context around my brain. It's less likely that I'll forget it. The benefit of writing down new pieces of information that you learn in a journal is that at any point you can just flip through it and then you're actively recalling these facts and concepts. Okay, so in summary, the technique of I+1 is pretty simple. You have your context and your one piece of information. That's the key to remembering everything. Anytime you come across a new vocabulary word or piece of information you want to remember, you want to think about what is the context that this new piece of information exists in. You could rewrite a concept in first person, reframe a concept in terms of your own life, or even just talk about something with as many people as possible, creating those memories of sharing this new knowledge that you learned. And if you just write it down and review it periodically, then you'll never forget it again.